Добрий день.
Шановні колеги, добрий день. Чекаємо кілька хвилин ще. Має під'єднатися пан Володимир.
Добрий день.
Добрий день.
Чомусь у мене камерка не спрацьовує.
Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Are you still in Japan or are you back in London?
I'm actually in North Wales. It's Dad's funeral tomorrow. So.
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry to
Yeah.
hear about that. That's yes.
Yeah, it's all come as a bit of a shock, but we just have to get on with it.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes. Well. Good luck with the funeral, Ethan.
Thanks.
Well, we had fun at my dad's funeral and my mum's funeral. You got to try and enjoy these occasions. But yeah, there's obviously all sorts of things. Well, we'll see.
I go back to Warsaw next week.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, I'm trying madly to finish the last chapter of the book. I'm on to Władysław, and I've told OUP that I will finish the draft by the 18th, when the 19th we're off to Munich, and then I will cut it down in Munich and send it to them in early January.
Right.
But we're
well,
nearly
good luck
there.
with that.
Yeah, I know what I want to write about Władysław. He's a complete bozo. He starts off so well, but then he thinks he's a proper king, which he isn't. His father, I have a much greater.
Yes, his father went the other way, didn't he?
Well, his father didn't. His father, I think, from the outset, was very, very canny. I think the whole "let's give the throne to Ernst" stuff was a complete charade. He wanted.
Well, in which case he started well and continued well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm convinced that what he was doing was saying to all of the bishops who'd supported Maximilian, said, right, either you stand with me against Zamoyski or I'm fucking off back to Sweden. And that really concentrated their minds. And Baranovsky, who was Zamoyski's man, begged him in Reval to come back. So he said, okay. But Jagiełło did. Jagiełło did exactly the same. When Jadwiga died, he said, okay, I'm off to Lithuania. Because it's not clear whether he's still king of Poland.
But it is interesting he gets the best reputation among Ukrainians, even though they revolted against him.
Yeah.
Right? He is the favored king and always said to be Ruskiego rodu. Yes, yes.
Jagiełło.
No, Władysław.
Yeah. Well, he starts off very well with the
well, and he ended rather well too by trying to make a deal with the Cossacks.
Yeah, well, that deal with the Cossacks was completely mad, because it was completely illegal. It was completely nuts. It was his view of being a proper king. Sigismund was far, far cannier. But there we go.
All right, we see.
when the book's out, I mean, it's nearly finished. I think Sigismund was one of the best kings that Poland ever had. Apart from religion. Religion was his weak spot. And that's where Władysław could. I mean, he was tolerant, personally. But his closest supporters were the bishops. Though what's remarkable about 1632, which I've just been working on, is the way that 6 bishops, in effect, signed the Warsaw Confederation. Anyway, I may say something about this when we get to the round table this afternoon. How are you, Frank?
All right, bearing up. Yeah, we wait day by day what blows come from the enemy from the south.
Yeah, God knows what's going on there.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope that Trump will finally realize that Putin is just playing with him.
No, I mean, as long as he can make money out of Russia, he doesn't care.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he is.
That's all he wants. Yeah.
That's all he wants. He doesn't care who owns the Donbass so long as he's making money out of it. But there we go.
And as long as he can attack Venezuela.
I mean, you know, given what he stood on, you know, the cost of living and no involvement in foreign wars, anybody who actually believes anything he says, like most of the people who've worked with him and then found that he doesn't give a shit about them.
But I don't think they believed it.
No, I think that's right.
I mean, no one could be near him and really not believe that this guy is out to get only his own. Yeah.
So they were unlike the Prussian aristocrats in 1932 who thought that they could manage Hitler because they didn't really know him. But this lot must know what he's like.
Yeah.
But there we are. So are you in Toronto, Frank, or?
I'm in Toronto. Yeah.
Well, we'll see. Alas, I can't attend after today because I'm off down south for a memorial service tomorrow. But it's interesting. I think I have some reservations about. I mean, I've concentrated on looking at chapter 1 because I mean, Zenon's great contribution is, you know, what's after chapter 1. I mean, the way he delineates that Cossack view of history is terrific. But I have a few.
Шановні колеги, я думаю, ми можемо починати. Я радий вас вітати від Українського товариства дослідників 18 століття. А так склалося, що ми проводимо 3-ю конференцію, і 3-я конференція, на жаль, онлайн. Ковід і зараз війна, яка не дає нам зібратися, вже всі втомилися від таких конференцій, але, на жаль, ми очно зібратися не можемо. Однак 2 попередні конференції наші були досить успішні. Сподіваюся, судячи з заявок, які подані, за що ми дуже вдячні, і нашим польським партнерам, спільно з яким ми проводимо цю конференцію, і всім іншим, хто долучився, нашим колегам, які теж цікавляться Україною в 18 столітті і взагалі цією проблематикою. Ми дуже вдячні і сподіваємось, попри те, що є багато різних проблем зараз в Україні, особливо це пов'язано із обстрілами, і з тим, що інколи в окремих регіонах не буває світла, інколи і термінові відключення світла, і але з цією сіитуацією ми постараємось, тобто українці вже навчилися з цим справлятися, але якось, так що можливі всякі форс-мажори, і я прошу вас бути до них готовими і ставитись до цього з розумінням. Судячи з того, що ми маємо досить плідні 3 дні, які маємо відпрацювати, і наші обидва товариства, і наші польські тут досить активно на це відгукнулися. Тому я сподіваюся, що все буде добре. Завчасно перепрошую, якщо виникнуть якісь негаразди в зв'язку із зв'язком або з перенесенням якихось доповідей, але сподіваюся, що ми це пройдемо, як це було всі 3 рази, чи 2 рази попередні, цього разу також. Бажаю успішної роботи всім. Також закликаю всіх, хто може підключатися не лише на свої панелі. Конференція дуже цікава, різнопланова. Ну і ми маємо прекрасні Keynote-лекції і презентації книжок. І бачите, що попри те, що йде війна, і книжки, українські історики пишуть книжки, книжки в Україні перевидаються наших зарубіжних колег, і ми маємо сьогодні презентації так, 2 книг і так далі. Тому я закликаю вас підключатися і включатись в обговорення, і сподіваюся, що ви плідно проведете час на цій конференції, і всі ми збагатимося знаннями і поділимося нашими здобутками. Ну, на жаль, сподіваємося, що наступна конференція буде вже не онлайн. Дякую за увагу. Прошу пана Міхала.
Szanowni Państwo, historycy wieku XVIII z Ukrainy i Polski, szanowni pany ta panowie, historyki XVIII stulecia z Ukrainy to Polski. W imieniu Polskiego Towarzystwa Badań nad wiekiem XVIII witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie podczas otwarcia 3-dniowej polsko-ukraińskiej konferencji naukowej. To niezwykle ważne wydarzenie naukowe zorganizowane zostało przede wszystkim wysiłkiem Ukraińskiego Towarzystwa Badań nad wiekiem XVIII oraz Narodowego Uniwersytetu w Kijowie Akademii Mohylańskiej, którym bardzo serdecznie za tę inicjatywę i ciężką pracę trwającą już długi czas bardzo serdecznie dziękuję. Wsparcie naszego towarzystwa było niewielkie, symboliczne, ale niemniej bardzo gorące i serdeczne. Kiedy w 2023 roku podczas Światowego Kongresu Badaczy XVIII wieku w Rzymie przedstawiciel naszego towarzystwa, wiceprezes Maciej Forycki, z wielkim przejęciem przedstawiał kandydaturę nowego Towarzystwa Narodowego z Ukrainy, wszyscy nie tylko popieraliśmy tę kandydaturę, ale byliśmy świadomi ogromnej wagi tego wydarzenia oraz jego potencjału naukowego dla rozbudowy możliwości badań nad wiekiem XVIII w naszej części Europy, w tym również nad XVIII-wieczną spuścizną dziejową dawnej Rzeczypospolitej. Dzisiejsze wydarzenie naukowe w pełni potwierdza, że oczekiwania były zasadne. O sile ukraińskiego środowiska historycznego, w tym badaczy XVIII wieku reprezentujących różne dyscypliny nauk humanistycznych, świadczy liczba referatów obecnych w programie konferencji. Naprawdę jest imponująca. Cieszy również to, że zaangażowani są w nią historycy zajmujący się na co dzień zagadnieniami stuleci nieco wcześniejszych. Ich wiedza i doświadczenie są ogromnie ważne, kluczowe dla refleksji nad wiekiem XVIII. Wiem to z własnego doświadczenia. O możliwościach i potrzebach współpracy naukowej i warsztatowej, w tym nad opracowaniem zachowanych źródeł i ich solidną edycją między historykami Polski i Ukrainy, można mówić długo. Wiele wątków zostanie z całą pewnością poruszonych w ciągu najbliższych dni. Chciałbym w tym miejscu podzielić się tylko 2 refleksjami, które są mi bliskie z własnego doświadczenia minionych 30 lat pracy naukowej. Jako wydawca źródeł z okresu nowożytnego, w szczególności tych XVIII-wiecznych, stanąłem kilkanaście lat temu wraz z 2 kolegami z Polski przed zadaniem ukończenia dzieła edytorskiego zainicjowanego jeszcze przed 1939 rokiem przez Wojciecha Hejnosza w Lwowie. Przygotowania kolejnego tomu akt sejmikowych obejmującego dawne województwo bełskie od końca XVI wieku do 1772 roku. II wojna światowa, jak wiemy doskonale, na dziesięciolecia uczyniła ukończenie tych prac niemożliwymi. W wyniku wieloletnich wysiłków w ramach Narodowego Programu Rozwoju Humanistyki możliwe stało się przygotowanie całkiem nowej, choć korzystającej z dorobku Wojciecha Hejnosza, to trzeba podkreślić, obszernej 3-tomowej edycji. Jej ostateczny kształt nie byłby możliwy bez ogromnej życzliwości wsparcia naukowego oraz edytorskiego naszego przyjaciela z Ukrainy, doktora Oleksija Winiczenki, który jest obecny na tej konferencji i bardzo się z tego cieszę, który już w 1998 roku przypominał o konieczności wydania akt sejmikowych województwa bełskiego. Dzięki jego pomocy nie tylko udało się dotrzeć do szeregu ważnych źródeł, ale również opracować wersję ukraińską wszystkich wstępów, skorygować ostateczny tekst oraz solidnie przygotować indeks nazw miejscowych. Prace nad edycją akt województwa bełskiego pokazały, jak ważne są wspólne wysiłki nad badaniem wspólnego dziedzictwa historycznego. Ziemie dawnego województwa bełżskiego są znakomitym przykładem. Jego tereny znajdują się przecież obecnie po obu stronach obecnej współczesnej granicy państwowej. Na polu edytorskim, ale również opracowania ogromnych zasobów archiwalnych, które są do dziś rozpoznane zaledwie w niewielkim zakresie, pozostaje wciąż wiele pracy dla przyszłych pokoleń. Druga refleksja, którą chciałem się dziś podzielić, dotyczy wybitnego polskiego historyka, znawcy dziejów XVIII-wiecznej Rzeczypospolitej Józefa Andrzeja Gierowskiego. W 1945 roku 23-letni wówczas student historii Józef Andrzej Gierowski zdał końcowe egzaminy magisterskie. Złożona w tym samym czasie praca magisterska dotyczyła tematu porównanie sejmiku proszowickiego i wiszeńskiego w latach 1572-1620. Powstawała podczas rozpoczętych w 1941 roku studiów w ramach tajnego uniwersytetu na Wydziale Filozoficznym Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego w warunkach niemieckiej okupacji nie tylko trudnych, ale wręcz zagrażających życiu studenta. Jeden z recenzentów, Kazimierz Piwarski, podkreślił wówczas, że drukowany materiał akt sejmikowych został wykorzystany sumiennie, a ze zbadania wcześniejszego dorobku historiografii autor wywiązał się poprawnie. Bliższa analiza tej pracy magisterskiej, dostępnej dziś w zasobie archiwum UJ, potwierdza, że Gierowski rzeczywiście wykonał swoje zadanie bardzo dobrze. Nie tylko skrupulatnie na podstawie wydanych już wówczas drukiem akt sejmikowych porównał oba badane sejmiki, ale przede wszystkim wykazał się doskonałym zmysłem analitycznym. Dostrzegł daleko idące podobieństwa ustrojowe, podkreślając jednak przede wszystkim różnice obu sejmików w zakresie postaw tworzącej je szlachty. Określił to mianem, i tu cytuję, różnic w zakresie ducha politycznego. Wyżej oceniając nowatorską, zaangażowaną i zmierzającą do korzystnych zmian w państwie szlachtę ruską, na tle zachowawczej, broniącej swego słabnącego w badanym okresie prymatu szlachty krakowskiej. Fakt, iż ten wybitny polski historyk pierwsze kroki stawiał właśnie badając przeszłość z perspektywy oddolnej, lokalnej i tej właśnie z pogranicza korony i Rusi, zaważył mocno na jego późniejszym znakomitym instynkcie naukowym. Świetnie rozumiał dawne państwo we wszystkich aspektach jego przeszłości. Wspomniany tu przykład, choć dotyczy przełomu wieków XVI i XVII, znalazł potwierdzenie również w badaniach moich własnych i dotyczył właśnie wspomnianego już wcześniej Sejmiku Województwa Bełżskiego. Pokazuje ten przykład, że na kształt dawnej Rzeczypospolitej wpływały w ogromnym stopniu wszystkie nacje, które go tworzyły, a wkład ten mógł być znaczny, wręcz kluczowy, niezależnie od bliższej lub dalszej odległości od Krakowa, Warszawy, Kijowa czy Wilna. Warto również podkreślić, że nawet trwająca wojna nie powstrzymała pasji młodego studenta Józefa Andrzeja Gierowskiego od zgłębiania tajników przeszłości. Ma to również dziś ogromne znaczenie, co widzimy niestety na własne oczy. Na koniec pragnę odnieść się do obecnej niezwykle dramatycznej i kluczowej sytuacji dziejowej, w jakiej przychodzi nam odbywać tę konferencję, o czym wspomniał już pan profesor. Trwająca od 2022 roku pełnoskalowa agresja Rosji na Ukrainę pociąga za sobą nieopisane straty i cierpienia całego narodu i państwa ukraińskiego. Polska, Polacy, również polscy historycy od początku jednoznacznie wspierają na różnych polach obronę państwa i narodu ukraińskiego. Dzisiejsze nasze spotkanie pokazuje natomiast wolę i hart ducha naszych ukraińskich przyjaciół, którzy w tak trudnej sytuacji znaleźli siły i czas, aby się spotkać i dyskutować o ważnych problemach naukowych. Życzę z całego serca, aby w najbliższym czasie mógł zapanować pokój i to taki pokój, który będzie sprawiedliwy i bezpieczny dla Ukrainy. Mam wielką nadzieję, że w nieodległej przyszłości, tak jak i pan profesor wyraził to życzenie, będziemy mogli się spotkać w Kijowie, w Warszawie albo w wielu innych miastach ukraińskich i polskich, aby rozmawiać o historii również tej XVIII-wiecznej, już nie tylko online. Przykład Józefa Gierowskiego pokazuje, że mądrość i pasja naukowa, nawet zrodzona w czasie wojny, może przynieść znakomite owoce. Życzę Państwu owocnych obrad i wielu pomysłów na współpracę. Bardzo dziękuję serdecznie.
Tak, dzięki. Так, шановні колеги, у нас ще є кілька хвилин. Може, хтось хоче долучитися і сказати кілька слів. Прошу.
Maybe I would say something in our third official language. That is, I am extremely pleased and impressed that in these difficult situations, the Ukrainian Association and the Polish Association have been able to organize such a magnificent conference. It is extremely impressive to look at the number of works and the number of topics that are being dealt with at this conference. When we began to discuss the formation of the association in Ukraine and bringing it into the International Association, I think a constant refrain was the neglect of the 18th century in Ukrainian historical studies relatively. Particularly in comparison to the 16th and 17th centuries. I think we're all very surprised when the first call went out for papers, how many papers were presented and how many people in Ukraine were working on various aspects of the 18th century. I don't know if that was known even to the specialists in the field. I know that when we gathered the material for our volume on the 18th century that Professor Volodymyr Shklokin so actively encouraged us to do, we began a series of translations of works by Ukrainian scholars into English. First, we put them up on the Yatsik Center website. The goal at that point was to bring what we thought was a little research field to an international community's attention. I'm very pleased when we look at that collection of 23 essays. I would estimate 19 of them written by Ukrainian scholars and now out in an English that can reach a wider audience. We can be proud of how much had been accomplished. But as each conference comes by, I more and more see the development of the field. And I particularly congratulate you on this very fruitful cooperation, which I think in the days that will follow, we will see many comparative topics. We will both see agreements and disagreements and various perspectives. I think that those agreements and disagreements will not be along national lines of the given participant and more along the lines of the preferences of a researcher for certain methods, certain viewpoints. All of this, I think, bodes well for the development of the field, and I wish you all a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, everybody. So now I think we are ready to proceed to our first event of our conference, keynote lecture by Professor Richard Butterwick. I see that Professor Butterwick is with us. Hello. Hello, Richard. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. And we have a chair of this keynote lecture, Natalia Volashkova, our vice president of the Ukrainian Society. And I'm not sure if Natalia is already with us. Natalia, are you with us? I don't see her. Yeah, so maybe Natalia has some technical problems. Maybe we could wait 2 more minutes and Natalia will join us. If not, I could replace her and moderate this session, the keynote lecture. So let's wait 2-3 minutes and let me check where is Natalia. Sorry, colleagues. Я зайнятий, бо конференція починається.
To niestety to przesunięcie czasowe może być pewnym problemem. Myśmy co prawda informowali w mailach wszystkich, żeby pamiętać o tym, że to jest według czasu kijowskiego wszystko podane, no ale to może być pewien problem u nas w Polsce. No i drugi, że trochę technicznie, bo pamiętam, że jak ja się logowałem dzisiaj, to musiałem instalować program Zoom Workplace. To może też dla niektórych być pewien problem. Mam nadzieję, że uda go się szybko rozwiązać.
Tak. Myślę, że to także musi być przyczyną. Ja napisał do pani Natalii, I wrote to her, but let us see if it helps. Okay, unfortunately, I don't get any reply from Natalia, but I think we could start anyway, and I will replace her as a chair of this first session of our conference, and my introduction will be very brief. Unfortunately, I was not prepared to introduce Professor Butterwick, but I'm very happy to say a few words about him. So, Richard Butterwick is a historian. He is professor of the Polish-Lithuanian history at the University College London. He is a renowned expert in the early modern history of Poland and East Central Europe. He is author of numerous excellent and fascinating publications. I will mention here only three, I suppose, last monographs. So, The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, 1733-1795, Light and Flame, published in 2020. Ukrainian edition appeared several months ago in 2025. Another book is The Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, Testament of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, published in 2022. And the last book, if I'm not mistaken, is Lithuania, a History, published this year in 2025. So, thank you very much, Professor Butterwick, for accepting our invitation, for being with us, and for opening our conference. We are really honored and happy to have you with us, and I look very much forward to your lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sklokin, for the kind introduction. And thank you very much to the Ukrainian Society for 18th Century Studies, in collaboration with the Polish Society for 18th Century Studies, for doing me the very great honor of asking me to inaugurate this conference. I can think of quite a few scholars who will be better qualified than myself to do so, who are present at this conference. So as I speak, I shall probably be suffering from imposter syndrome, and I'm extremely aware of my own limitations. It will probably turn out that the blank spots that I'll be talking out are not as blank as I assume, and I would welcome information that there are publications on the various areas, as of which I am still, but I hope not for much longer, ignorant. So once again, I also apologize for the state of my voice. I hope that it's not going to put too many people off. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Is that everyone can see the screen at the moment?
We can see, yeah.
Looks like I got entirely the wrong end of the presentation, but I'll have to start it. There we are. Yeah. So we have red flags and blank spots in research on the Polish-Ukrainian 18th century. And I'll explain what I mean by red flags and blank spots, and I'll explain what I mean by the Polish-Ukrainian 18th century. I shall say straight away that it is a much shorter 18th century, and it is a much narrower geographical area than what we're likely to hear about from Frank Sissin tomorrow. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the Ukrainian lands that remained in the Polish crown from the moment when the division of 1686 and 1699 sort of settled down towards the end of the Great Northern War, and a period of resettlement began, and that remained in the Polish crown until the three partitions, respectively, of 1772, 1793, and 1795. In other words, I'm going to be talking about right bank Ukraine, Podolia, Volhynia, and Halych or Red Ruthenia, corresponding to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's palatinates of Kyiv, Bratslav, Podolia, Volhynia, Ruthenia, and Belz. This, in other words, I'm not going to include the southern fringes of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in Polysia that are now in Ukraine, and nor, despite my awareness of the importance of cross-frontier connections, whether they are military or political or economic, cultural, religious or intellectual, am I going to be discussing the city and the immediate environs of Kyiv, or Zaporizhia, or the Hetmanate, or Sloboda, Ukraine, or the lands annexed by the Russian Empire from the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate, or Galicia after 1772, or Bukovina, or Transcarpathia. So that radically reduces the task, but nevertheless, it's still a very considerable area over a long period when a great deal of interest for Ukrainian history and for Polish history and for European history more generally occurred. I could also mention in passing that I'm very fond of this particular background to the slide, which I often use with students to give them a completely different perspective on Europe to the one that they sort of tend to associate with. So you could say that this is from Turkey looking across the Crimea through Western Ukraine into Poland and northwards to sort of put things into what I consider a much more important perspective for the center of the continent than a traditional one. So here you can see the administrative division of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the first partition. And I'm going to risk an assumption that the Ukrainian or Ruthenian lands that remained in the Commonwealth in this period are much less well researched for the period between the Great Northern War and the respective partitions than the lands that came under Russian rule or from 1772 Austrian rule. And as evidence, I will point to the excellent volume that's already been talked about, co-edited by Frank Sisson and Volodymyr Sklokin, among others, 18th Century Ukraine, published in Montreal. Very useful book indeed, but it has to be said that not very much of it actually refers to the Commonwealth in this period. Having said that, and I'm conscious of how much has changed even since the last conference of the Ukrainian Society of 18th Century Studies I had the honor to participate in, the number of exceptions and the importance of those exceptions continues to grow. Now, this is evident in the program of the conference that we are now beginning. Top of the list would be the Uniate Church, particularly the Basilian Order, with its publishing activities, education, also the role of Jesuit colleges in the region, architecture. There is particularly dynamic development in the field of inter and trans-confessional relations between the Latin and the Ruthenian rites, between the Uniate Church and the Orthodox Church. Jewish history continues to flourish, and that particularly relates to the Palatinates of Ruthenia and Podolia, where Jewish settlement was particularly dense. Podolia in particular has a well-deserved reputation as a seedbed of religious and social ferment in Jewish communities. I'll also risk another assumption that the implications of new approaches to the Polish-Ukrainian 16th and 17th centuries, which have made such an impact on the historiography and continue to debate huge amounts of debate and even controversy, are yet to be fully worked out, particularly in the social and political history of the 18th century, as regards the lands of Ukraine that remained in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. To continue on the sort of the geographical delineation, the first partition of 1772 brought the loss to the Commonwealth of most of the Palatinates of Ruthenia and Belz, as well as the western part of the Palatinate of Podolia. But that wasn't the end of it, as the border delineation following the partition and into the 1780s brought continuing Russian encroachments into the environs of Kyiv and into the southeast of the Palatinates of Kyiv and Bratslav. In general, if you look at the map of the Commonwealth after the first partition, it's a rather strange shape. It's like a sort of a T put on its side. Emanuel Rostvorovsky, at the very end of his life in 1989, but in a work that wasn't published until 2 years later, realized just how important this was. The boundaries of the Commonwealth after 1772 and before 1793 were more unlike the boundaries of the current Republic of Poland than any before or since. and that 3/4 of the territory and 2/3 of the population of the Commonwealth at that time are now in Ukraine or Belarus or Lithuania or Latvia, and only about half of the territory of the Commonwealth at that time is currently part of the Republic of Poland. In other words, somewhat provocatively, you could say that this is the least Polish map of Poland that you are ever likely to see. And this is going to color everything that needs to be said about the condition of the Commonwealth after the first and before the second partition. Just how important this was is borne out by the demography of the Commonwealth. These are the figures that were calculated from the tax returns by Fryderyk Moszyński in 1789 and 1790. And on the left, you can see the absolute numbers of the population. And you can see that the two most populous palatinates of the Commonwealth were the palatinates of Volhynia and Bratslav. And on the right is population density, perhaps less of a surprise, but just look at the palatinate of Podolia. It was the most densely settled part of the entire Commonwealth. And this leads to the more general point that no part of the Commonwealth developed in economic or demographic terms more rapidly, probably from the 1720s onwards, than the southeast, which is to say that part of Ukraine, which remained in the Commonwealth after the Great Northern War. Now, that seems to me against the background of a vast demographic expansion, when the overall population of the Commonwealth rose from 6 or 7 million in the aftermath of the Great Northern War to at least 12, and possibly, according to Rostrodowski, as much as 14 just before the first partition. You have a doubling of the overall population of the Commonwealth in half a century, and that expansion was fastest in the Ukrainian and Ruthenian lands. That's another condition that we simply cannot ignore. We get to the second partition of 1793, when the wars fought by the Russian Empire against the Ottoman Empire revealed just how strategically important these lands were. And this brought the loss to the Commonwealth of the palatinates of Kyiv and Bratslav and Podolia, and about half of Volhynia. This was a devastating blow. These were some of the most populous, the most advanced and fertile parts of the Commonwealth, particularly in the south. And you might also notice that the eastern border of the Commonwealth more or less matches that of the Second Republic of Poland between the wars, with one important exception. Along the river Pripyat, the border bulges westwards rather than eastwards, in a reverse of the same strategic reasons that the border was placed there in 1921. Now, where should we start with? I would suggest that the suitable starting point is to go back 25 years, or 28 years for the Ukrainian edition, to a real turning point in Natalia Yakovenko's reinterpretation of a good deal of Ukrainian early modern history, and see how that played out in her treatment of the 18th century. She devoted about 60 pages, I'm quoting the Polish edition's pages there, of her history of Ukraine to the end of the 18th century to the 18th century, and of that, half, roughly 30 pages, was devoted to the parts of Ukraine that remained in the Commonwealth until the partitions. And so chapter 6.1 Kolishchina or Vernihora's prophecy, the dilemma of Ukrainian-Polish relations. And this antithesis is used as a metaphor. Vernihora's prophecy seen as a sort of a romantic sort of wishing that things had gone differently, that the brothers had been divided. This is essentially one of the Polish perspectives, not the only one. And then Kolishchina, the root of violence with religious and social and national elements to it, and the road of conflict focused very much on the peasant majority of the population. She starts by asking, to what extent is this actually Polish history as we might understand the word Polish, and makes the important point that in various parts of the Commonwealth, people understood the term Polak very differently, that it was possible for regional and national patriotisms to combine and to overlap. And she points to Volhynia as a case in point, overlapping with a very particular kind of religious fervor, not to say fanaticism. She goes on to say that the Szlachta of the Ruthenian Palatinates chose Poland over Russia, given the choice, which produced an accelerated process of self-Polonization in linguistic, cultural, and presumably political terms as well. She challenges assumptions that extreme magnate domination meant that the great aristocrats could do what they liked and order around lesser nobles with impunity, but nevertheless also points that some areas at least saw very large latifundia indeed, with large numbers of leaseholders and sub-leaseholders, making the actual landowner a very distant figure indeed. Having said that, in many areas, wealthy noble families, the so-called panovia, remained a force very much to be reckoned with, but she calls for further research on the similarities and differences in mentality and religiosity from, for example, the nobles of the sort of ethnically Polish lands. And I'm reminded here of what Professor Zwierzchikowski said about Professor Gierowski's ability to compare the nobles participating in the sejmiks at Proszowice and at Wisna. So, she also accentuated the particular role of monastic foundations in both rites, the Latin rite and the Ruthenian or Uniate rite, founded by noble families, and the particular role played by miraculous images, again in both rites, which saw a disproportionate share going right into the late 18th century, I would add, of their coronations. She also notes the beginning of the fascination among some of the noble elites with their Cossack heritage, a tendency that will grow much stronger in the 19th century. Moving on to townspeople, she notes that the identity was largely dependent on their faith, whether they were of the Catholic or, as was often referred to, Polish faith, or of the Greek or Ruthenian faith, but generally notes a reduction in levels of antagonism compared to the 17th century. On the whole, she paints a grim picture of urban economic and civic stagnation, although it was relieved by manufactories established in magnate latifundia and by noble residences in towns. Lviv in particular saw very large numbers of nobles taking up residences, which was a phenomenon found in most of the larger towns of the Commonwealth. Certainly true of Vilnius and Warsaw and Poznan. Then the Jewish population, of course, grew dramatically, notes the origin of the characteristic shtetls or small towns with a predominantly Jewish character. And this was fertile ground, both for religious revival. She points to Hasidism rather than Frankism, as well as Christian-Jewish conflicts, including incidents of the blood libel, such as the persecutions at Zhytomyr in 1753 by Bishop Kajetan Soltych. However, when we move on to the what is referred to as the Kolishchina side of the coin, things look a little different. She writes that the traditional ethnic Ukrainian identity, there's no questioning of that, of the silent or inert peasants, was largely untouched by the shift from orthodoxy to the Union. Because the peasants continued to use a different language and go to a different church to the lords, who, despite Polonization, would still use Ukrainian or Ruthenian in their sort of contacts with them. And she goes on then to challenge assumptions of aggressive proselytization, instead positing a far-reaching indifference in both confessional and linguistic terms on the part of the lords towards their peasant subjects. Labour services were, of course, ratcheted upwards over the course of the 18th century, although they still remained much higher further west in the Palatinates of Ruthenia and Volhynia than they did in the far southeast, which was recently resettled following the cycle of wars. Conflict was endemic, but it varied greatly in scale, from petitions submitted by the Hromada to the Manor to violent rebellion, with sort of all stages in between. Now, naturally, she goes on to write, the Commonwealth was not immune from the peasant rebellions that also affected neighbouring territories. And in connection with this, she notes the role of various frontiers: the Russian frontier, the Ottoman frontier, the Moldavian frontier, and the Hungarian or Carpathian frontiers, and the borderlands that these frontiers created. Although there was no longer an autonomous Cossack organization within the Commonwealth, what she calls the symptom of a fundamental sickness in relations were the Haidamaks and the Obrisheks, which played on nobles' fear of rebellion, and as well as popular legends among the population. She also called for a more ethnological rather than class-based approach to the Hutsuls and the Obrisheks. She sees the Haidamaks as Cossack-style organized military formations who raided and plundered estates, moving backwards and forwards across the border. But this increasingly overlapped with the intensified Orthodox Uniate conflict from the mid-1760s. She writes that the Kolishchina in 1768 was sparked both by executions carried out by fanatically Confederates of Bar and this is perhaps a little more controversial, by Russian provocation against Poles and Jews. She does not gloss over the Uman slaughter, although she notes that the overall death toll, both in Uman and elsewhere, needs verifying. And then comes, I think, the sort of the key message. Writing as a non-specialist on the 18th century, she writes, the historian does not judge, but tries to understand their heroes. I don't think heroes is quite the right way to translate that into English, but it will have to stand. Listening without prejudice both to the killer and to the victim, because both are to them equal subjects of the past. But unfortunately, the Haidamashchina has not yet been researched from this point of view. Interesting to see whether you feel that is still the case. Then things more or less come to a halt. There is very little else in this subchapter on the nobles, the burghers, the Jews, or the peasants from 1770 through to 1795 in the last quarter of a century of the Commonwealth. This is a little different, however, when it comes to religion, which is the final section of this subchapter. And she explains the change of allegiance from the orthodoxy to the union and how this was, on the whole, not particularly traumatic, and then posits gradual Latinization of liturgy and architecture after something that's more recently been sort of challenged, the 1720 Synod of Zamość. Notes also the erosion of barriers between Latin and Greek rites, overlapping baptisms and marriages, the linguistic Polonization that started from the higher clergy downwards, but didn't reach most of the parish clergy, and the achievements of the Basilian order in publishing, the training of priests and wider education, continuing into the Commission of National Education founded in 1773, as well as the long-term impact of the Vilna School District. And this is certainly an area that since then has mushroomed. Moving forward, looking forward, she notes that the return of Uniate parishes, return in inverted commas, to orthodoxy in the Russian Empire in 1795 to 97. Again, that might be said to have started a little earlier. This led to some switching to Latin Rite Catholicism, but she sees this unequivocally as a means of Russifying the newly acquired territories. And then standard point that the Austrian support for Greek Catholics laid the foundations for the clerical role in the Ukrainian nation-building process. Overall, we could say that there are challenges to Soviet paradigms of class conflict, as well as to some Ukrainian and some Polish nationalist assumptions. If we're going to see this in terms of highlighting red flags, well, clearly the obvious one is the Kolishchina and more generally the Haidamaks, as well as the question of what is meant and how far did it extend of Polonization. As for blank spots, these are concentrated in particular after the first partition. But among the consequences of that, of those blank spots, of the neglect of the period after the first partition, is that we do not get a consideration of where the Commonwealth was headed, what was its trajectory, and what was its potential in those final 2 decades, or perhaps the final decade or so. So I thought it was worthwhile at some length to sort of recall as a starting point the synthetic proposal of Natalia Yakovenko, such a distinguished historian, looking at the 18th century, as it were, from the perspective of the 16th and 17th. So I now wish to sort of consider the red flags of the Haidamaks and the Kolishchina. Now, red flags in the sense that a red flag may provoke a bull. That a red flag is a warning sign that conflict, violence may lie ahead. I mean, I hope it's not going to get to violence in the case of historians. Although if you think of the sort of the red flags that are currently dividing opinion formers in both Poland and Ukraine with regard to the events of the middle of the 20th century, then you might think that perhaps it's not entirely far-fetched. I do think, however, that events from the sort of the middle of the 18th century also have some potential to provoke, well, certainly disagreement and possibly conflict. The theme was sort of handed down to posterity through memoirs, mostly written by sort of nobles or clergymen, sometimes by Jews. In other words, that provided one side of this, but also by folk traditions among the peasantry, the descendants of participants. And it found expression in memorable romantic poetry, among others, Słowaczki on the Polish side, notabene Słowaczki born in Volhynia, recalled that his grandmother spoke better Ruthenian than Polish. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, Taras Shevchenko's Haidamaki, which is far from being far from being sort of an entirely sort of one-sided, unambiguous reflection on tragic events, as you can see from the illustration sort of I've attached of the motif of Ivan Honta mourning the sons who had attended the Catholic Basilian monastery school in Uman that he killed or sacrificed, depending on the perspective, by the distinguished Ukrainian artist Ivan Marchuk. In Ukrainian historiography, and of course there will be many who will know this far better than me, Volodymyr Antonovich sort of posited that the Haida Machina moved from a sort of an essentially sort of a banditry phenomenon through a genuine social struggle into a full-scale national uprising. That for a long time, the most prominent work on the Polish side, Franciszek Rawita-Gawroński, sort of two-part work on the history of the Haidamach movement, was sort of unhesitatingly used sort of epithets like bloodthirsty and savage by nature, and even went so far as to explain such savagery in the so-called Turanian or Mongol racial origins rather than Slavic racial origins of the Ukrainian population. A great deal can be gleaned from Władysław Konopczyński's classic work on the Confederacy of Bar. But while Konopczyński was certainly not afraid to criticize the Szlachta and point out mistakes, he was very much on the side of the Confederates, and he was very much in the camp of Polish nationalism. The real breakthrough came from Władysław Serczyk's monograph on the Kolishchina and his more popular book on the Haidamachs. The monograph in particular was written explicitly with the aim of approaching the subject sine ira et studia. He was concerned to put the movement into its social, economic, and other contexts. Given the time in which he was writing, you would have to say that the social-economic contexts were sort of more important to him than the others, and he did tend to sort of play down the Russian role in events, but he saw nation building mainly as consequence rather than cause of the movement. He certainly challenged explicitly a number of Polish nationalist tropes. On the other side, in Emigration, Petro Miociuk's book on the Kolishchina saw this certainly as a national uprising, first and foremost, although, of course, he acknowledged religious and social elements, and put a rather controversial case that the hetmanate was refounded by Maxim Zalizniak. It was not irrelevant that Petro Miociuk had been involved in the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army, and most of these publications dealt with them and the 20th century rather than with the 18th. At about the same time, in Soviet Ukraine, and that also is visible in the way in which the subject was approached, was Hryhory Hraman's works, which are finally published thanks to the efforts of his colleagues in Uman in the 21st century in full. And this was, as you might expect, above all an anti-feudal uprising, although it of national liberation, but it did have some religious elements. But there was also a concern to sort of make the participation as wide and as international as possible, rather than essentially sort of that of Ukrainians. Zenon Kohut sort of rather critically reviewed the state of the historiography in the late 1970s. His chief target were Soviet myths of sort of unadulterated, sort of an oversimplified class conflict. But at the same time, he also sort of took aim at sort of nationalist approaches that, in his view, went far beyond what could be what could be gleaned from the sources. He did view Serčik's work with considerable respect. I might add, however, that an attempt to look at wider contexts could be seen in an article published by Jarosław Pelensky not long after that. More recent work, including as well as the older things, and I've been much helped here, have been summed up by Tadeusz Srogosz, particularly after his visit to Human and his double article with Władysława Sokiewska about comparing the historiography of the Kolyszczyna. But what has happened, I think, in the last generation is that the religious factor has taken center stage, and this, to a great extent, is to the credit of Barbara Skinner, starting with the article she published in Slavic Review in 25, and then subsequently in her book, the Western Front of the Eastern Church, and this introduces the idea of confessional borderlands, which are shifting. They're not a straightforward line. It's a borderland that generally shifted eastwards towards the political frontier over the middle decades of the 18th century until that moment of open conflict came in the 1760s. So this sense of borderland has been a very fruitful area of research, but it is also has the potential as a red flag, not least because Skinner was portraying Uniates, that is to say Ukrainian Uniates, also as victims of Ukrainian Orthodox when it came to the most intense part of the violence. And then since then, as I've said, we've got the current work on the Basilians and on a wide variety of inter and trans-confessional relations. So that's by way of red flags. Now, the next rather long theme is what has changed as a result of the general historiographical, or more generally, much beyond far beyond historian, shift to post-colonial theory, the ideas of decolonization. Is this an opportunity or a threat for deeper understanding of the Polish-Ukrainian 18th century? So, everyone's, of course, has encountered the trends of decolonialization and critical race theory. There have been many demands, and no doubt will be many demands, for colonial powers to make apologies, to make restitutions, and to make reparations. But we've also seen what has to be described as a certain degree of competition from various quarters for a status of victimhood, both of genocide and more generally of colonial and imperial oppression. That's become, of course, particularly acute given the way in which Russia has attacked Ukraine, particularly since 2013-14. At the same time, we've also seen a decline, and some might call it a collapse, of Western self-confidence, which has affected the way in which the past is approached. So perhaps, buying into or participating into narratives and approaches of decolonization or post-colonialism may well be the only way for historians of a misunderstood part of the world, not to say sometimes a calumniated part of the world, to make any impact at all. But of course, they do leave questions open. What are colonial relationships? Over the last generation, we've seen the spreading field of comparative imperiology, which leads us to ask, skeptically, how similar were relations in Western European overseas empires to those in the eastern lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? And when we might follow up on that. There's been discussion about whether the Commonwealth was in some respect an empire. Was it a kind of republican empire? And Novak has been particularly interested in this idea of the Commonwealth between a republic and an empire. Now, without going so far as Tomasz Henkonarski has sort of recently pointed out, as to making an assumption that the Commonwealth sort of was like sort of 19th century Algeria, for example, we might ask, more plausibly, how comparable was the situation in early modern Ukraine and Rus to the situation in early modern Ireland with its Anglo-Irish Protestant elite? We could also ask how applicable to the region are racialized theories of Orientalism. And now on the screen, you can see the Polish edition, a quite recent Polish edition of Larry Wolff's classic 1994 work, Inventing Eastern Europe. Brilliant book. It's immensely stimulating. It's beautifully written. It really gets you thinking about perceptions. But there is a problem. There is no hard evidence anywhere in the book that anyone in so-called Western Europe actually referred to Eastern Europe. The nearest it comes is one reference on the battlefield of Poltava made by the Marquis de Ségur to the Orient of Europe. And that's just the battlefield of Poltava in 1787. There's no evidence that sort of any of the luminaries of the Enlightenment ever referred to sort of Eastern Europe at all. There's also a wider question here of whether projections of an Orient made by sort of privileged travelers or observers from, whether you want to call it the south, the north, the west, you name it, actually sort of reduced or ignores the potential for agency on the spot, locals, or to use the language of the discourse, subalterns. And of course, we also need to, as ever as historians, ask what changed over time and space. So returning to opportunities, it has been clear for over the last decade that there is a pressing need to decolonize, or perhaps a little more neutrally, decenter Russia from East European and Eurasian studies. This has been apparent in some of the big congresses of ISIS and ASIS over the last few years. But it can lead to polemics. Has Poland been more colonized than colonizing, or is it the other way around? From whose perspective? And if so, when? Certainly, this goes back quite a long way, back to Daniel Beauvoir, at least. There have been very critical interrogations of the Polish myth of the Kresy, particularly as it developed in the 19th and into the 20th century, including those by sort of historians of literature, historians of art, as well as historians of ideas. The question has to be asked, whatever the answer is, was Ukraine colonized? First by Poles in the early modern period, and then by Russians, and then perhaps to some extent by Poles again in the sort of interwar period. And if so, how would we characterize those processes of colonization? Taking even with a skeptical approach to assumptions of colonization, to what extent are profoundly asymmetrical and unequal social, political, religious, cultural relations colonial? And to what extent are they simply sort of unequal asymmetrical and unjust, because I don't think anyone is pretending that everyone was equal, that everyone loved each other in the 18th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And some of these questions have been posed more with regard to the 16th and 17th century by Yuri Zazuliak, but specifically with regard to the end of the 18th century by Tomasz Hen-Konarski. Another historiographical trend of the last generation, perhaps the last two generations, has been the rehabilitation of the Respublika. I specifically use the Latin there to emphasize the republican character of the Rzeczpospolita or Commonwealth. But in recent years, this has met with quite a backlash, particularly in non-specialist or political science literature, and the form of the popular or peasant turn in Ukrainian history. And to see how this is now making an impact in popular culture, you can see a poster for the second series in Ukrainian of the series, Netflix series 1670. Which adopts something like a Monty Python approach of ridicule to the 17th century Polish szlachta, their approach to the world, their ignorance, and the way in which they oppressed and exploited in the stupidest possible fashion their peasants. Now, this is quite a cult following. On the one hand, it shows that sort of Poles today, at least some of them, are quite prepared to laugh at themselves. And yet, if this were to be the sort of the predominant representation and imagination of the sort of old Commonwealth, I rather fear that something important and valuable might get lost. And as this poster sort of indicates, there's considerable potential for Ukrainians to see this as merely confirmation of everything they've always sort of believed about the Polish lords. Anyway, before we even got to any rehabilitation, there were centuries, indeed, going back to the 18th century, where the Commonwealth and its reputation was excoriated as a synonym or a byword for anarchy, oppression, fanaticism, and in modern political science jargon, often assumed to be completely obvious, a failed state. And in terms of the partitioning powers, obviously had a vested interest in sort of doing down the Commonwealth's reputation and later its memory. There's a fairly straight line from Frederick II's sneers about the Iroquois of Europe through to sort of West German jokes about Polnische Wirtschaft in the 20th century, something that might seem a little ironic now, considering the state of German infrastructure. But in Poland, too, there is also a line of excoriating criticism of the Szlachta and its selfishness and the consequences it brought in terms of the downfall of the state, from the Stańczyks of Galicia in the sort of 1860s, through Roman Dmowski, whose critique of the old Commonwealth is one of the most far-reaching ever penned, through to more recent assaults on the Commonwealth, such as those made by Jan Sowa. Now, long before that took place, then the Commonwealth have also, of course, had its defenders. The first point I would make the most obvious one to me is that it ignores the actual trajectory and the actual events, certainly of the second and third partitions. The last decades of the Commonwealth brought renewal and its destruction because of the threat presented to the neighbouring powers by that renewal, rather than a simple trajectory of downfall and collapse, which is still all too often simply assumed. Some of the reaction has to be put down to a sort of an emotional sort of response of sort of nationalists or patriots that, to defend the honor of their country from foreigners who laugh at it. You might say that this is the approach of Polonia semper fidelis, must be defended, even if among ourselves it's possible to make these criticisms. God forbid that any such criticism should come from outside. Perhaps some of the reaction against the dismissal of the Commonwealth was produced by the Polish People's Republic itself, which produced a degree of nostalgia for sort of better times in the past, and an interest in genealogy, so that people could trace themselves back to the sort of the noble families of the past, despite the fact that it's fairly obvious that the great majority of the people of Poland have far more peasant ancestors than they do burgher or noble ancestors. Robert Frost, here with us today, has eloquently made the case that the Commonwealth, like indeed any other political community, deserves to be judged in its own terms, and not with the hindsight or later assumptions that are essentially related to the partitions. He has assaulted the idea that it should be judged as if it were a modern state that went wrong, rather it was a political community, or to put it more precisely, a union of political communities, which on the whole came together through voluntary union rather than inheritance or conquest. There's certainly been a huge amount of interest over the last generation and more in civic republican values. For the 18th century, but going back from that towards the 16th, the most distinguished figure has been Anna Grzeszkowiak-Krawicz, and for the 16th century in particular, Dorota Pietrzyk-Reeves. But there are many other republican fans. In fact, it's become something of a fad in certain parts of the ideological spectrum to declare oneself a conservative Republican. But the other trend is in some ways going the other way ideologically, to sort of to celebrate the idea of a commonwealth of many nations, many faiths, and many cultures. And the number of conferences and collective volumes which have had some combination of a commonwealth of many nations, many faiths, and many cultures is probably beyond counting by this stage. And very enjoyable these occasions are, but it, perhaps the atmosphere of celebrating diversity does lead to a disincentive to ask some rather hard questions about the hierarchies and the inequalities and the asymmetries between nations, faiths, and cultures. Andrzej Sulima-Kamiński, important in celebrating and rehabilitating civic republican values, has also been one of those who has been keenest on seeing the Commonwealth as a community of many nations, many faiths, many cultures, to the extent that particularly when it comes to anything to the sort of east of the Niemen or east of the Bug, you could say that he is emphasizing that this wasn't Poland in any kind of sort of recognizable sense. We'll find the opinion, particularly in his general sort of interpretative history of the Commonwealth from 2000, that Poland was never in Polsk, for example. In Ukraine, we've seen something of immense importance over a generation, a degree of research and also re-evaluation, the role of the Ruthenian and Ukrainian nobility in the Commonwealth and as citizens of the Commonwealth in the works, first of Natalia Yakovenko, and then more recently in a book that is now making quite some waves in Poland, in its Polish version, of Natalia Starchenko, the Volhynian nobility, based on court cases in the 16th and 17th century Palatinate of Volhynia. One of the consequences of asking the question about whether sort of nobles of the southeast of the Commonwealth might be considered as Polish nobles or Ukrainian nobles has been felt in museum studies. There are, the heritage inherited from the past, not necessarily always appreciated by Soviet policymakers. Whose is it? To what extent is this part of Ukrainian cultural heritage? This is a challenge that sort of many museum specialists, many librarians have sort of risen to. And palaces perhaps are not seen merely as monuments of feudal oppression in Ukraine today. And this has led to sort of many valuable sort of partnerships, particularly in wartime, with treasures being moved to more secure locations, sometimes even in Poland. And above all, there is the fallback argument. Well, what about the alternative, the Muscovite Russian alternative of autocracy and despotism? It would be enough to make anyone sort of reconsider the relationship between the Commonwealth, between Ukraine and Poland, within the Commonwealth. But if that all seems to be sort of pushing in one direction, then recent years have seen the sort of the popular or peasant turn, which has, in some respects, captured the attention of the Polish reading public, with Adam Leszczyński's Ludowa Historia Polski, and the various sort of popular works written by sort of Kamil Janicki. It's become very easy to sort of see several centuries of history for the majority of the population as more or less slavery, oppression, undifferentiated, unsophisticated, violent, intended to shock. Now, neither of those two are what you might call proper historians, particularly not Janicki. There are plenty of sophisticated approaches to the study of peasants, as Thomas Wiślicz, I'll be referring to one of his works a little later, expert on religiosity, particularly in the province of Lesser Poland, but extending into sort of parts of the Ukrainian lands. But, in my view, the most important historian of peasants in Poland at the moment is Mateusz Wyżga, a peasant farmer himself, a descendant of those who sort of fought at the Battle of Ratsławice, and someone who embodies the traditions and at the same time has spent immense periods in archives understanding what estate records and court records actually mean for people's lives. Someone who has brought out some of the variety of the experience and some of the considerable amount of agency that many peasants could have, even in very asymmetrical and unequal relationships with their lords. So we need to think about what are the implications, first of all, of the sort of the tide of rehabilitation of the Commonwealth, and then about the more recent sort of popular turn, sometimes referred to by its critics as hate against the Szlachta, how this might play out in the Ukrainian lands that remained in the Commonwealth. Well, there are plenty of opportunities for social, local, and micro histories, both urban and rural. The sources for the 18th century are more copious than they are for the 16th and 17th. On the whole, there are plenty of court records, plenty of estate records, plenty of correspondence in a great variety of archives and libraries. Now, this is only, of course, the slightest sample, and of course there will be, I would welcome more information about some of the exciting research that is being conducted. But I could hardly fail to sort of single out Miron Capra for his pioneering works on the city of Lviv over several centuries, looking at the privileges contributing to the atlas. An example of a sort of a multi-communal study of a town might be seen as Renata Król-Mazur's work on Kamieniec-Podilski. An example, there are others, of interactions between Christians and Jews in a Ruthenian small town would be Stefan Gonsharovsky's work. And then something I find really exciting. It really does read brilliantly. Tomasz Wiślicz's book about Zelman Wolfowicz, a Jewish factor, and his role in the Drohobycz Starostwo in the 18th century. This really is an example of the kind of exciting, attractive work that people want to read, but it is set in sort of local communities. And another example of how to reach the world and tell the world that this history is exciting, that it is Katarina Disser's work on sort of witchcraft trials in Ukraine, but specifically in Volhynia, Podolia, and Ruthenia. In the 17th and 18th centuries. The more monographs like that we can get published in English, the better. More could be done, certainly, when it comes to the history of local elites, local institutions, and local and Commonwealth politics. The kind of re-evaluation of the nobility accomplished by Natalia Nerkovenko, Natalia Starchenko. How much more of this could be done for the 18th century? Natalia Yakovenko herself sort of pointed to the particular sort of mentality or indeed fanaticism of the nobles of Volhynia, who were notorious for taking a more critical view of the constitution of the 3rd of May 1791 than anywhere else in the entire Commonwealth, far more so than in any part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That's something that's been known sort of for more than a century, but a great deal more could be discovered about the Volhynian nobles and the Volhynian Sejmiks of the 18th century. The fundamental research on office holders for the Ruthenian lands, I think, is almost complete. I was searching, but I couldn't find the volume for the Bratslav Palatinate, but perhaps someone will correct me. But I think all the others have for some time been done. There are examples of the work of those who represented the region, Veswan Bondir on the Palatinate of Ruthenia, and we have the sort of the excellent work of Ihor Smutok, now available in Polish as well as Ukrainian, of the Ruthenian Slab of the Przemyśl district of the Palatinate of Ruthenia over a very long period indeed. And I'm very glad that Michał Zwierzykowski has already sort of talked about the importance of cooperation and research across both sides of the Polish-Ukrainian border in the preparation of the Sejmik Acts of the Palatinate of Belz. Now this, let me add, is a model edition of how to publish the records of a Sejmik, including a lot of the supporting documentation, not just the lauda, not just the instructions, but some of the official correspondence and reports that were made around it. So we need more of this kind of thing. But thank you very much, Michał, and Robert, and all those who worked with you for pointing the way. So there is a huge amount that still remains to be done on the nobility of most of the Ukrainian lands that remained in the Commonwealth in the 18th century. Now, to finish, please allow me to say something about a more political approach, and why I think this is important, and why I think that this should be of interest. Following the first partition, the politics of the Commonwealth is usually written up in terms of the battles between King Stanislaw August on the one hand and the magnate opposition on the other, with Catherine generally favouring King Stanislaw August, but having a second option through Ksavary Branicki, who had married Potemkin's niece. And this is the rather sterile set of politics that was maintained by Russia through most of the 1770s and 1780s, explored above all by those who looked at particular Sejmiks. Jerzy Michalski, of course, set the standards for this, but most of this has actually been done in recent years by Witold Filipczak, with important contributions for the Palatinate of Kyiv by Tadeusz Sorogosz. The question is, however, most of the research is based on the king's correspondence and to some extent on magnate correspondence. To what extent are we actually seeing the perspective of those important families of local significance rather than the way in which royal or magnate instructions are received and then partially implemented? Branicki is particularly important, partly because of the immensely rich Starostwo Bila Cerkva, partly because of his military patronage, and Volhynia was generally regarded as his stamping ground, where he had particular influence over the officers. And then moving to the Palatinate of Bratslav, a great amount of which he owned, there's the endlessly fascinating figure with a tragic biography of Stanisław Szczęsny Potocki. In heritage terms, he's already big. There is the palace at Tulchin. There is the famous Sofiivka path, and yet Potocki is known mainly through the popular biographies by Jerzy Wojek of the traitor and of his third wife, the beautiful Bithynian, but most of what we know in terms of Potocki's political significance and his choices comes from the research of Emanuel Rostvorovsky, but not on Ukrainian archives. Most of this comes from what was kept in Krakow in the Biblioteka Czartoryskiej. So there is a huge opportunity to look at the Potocki latifundium in the Palatinate of Bratslav as a kind of world in itself. The border itself is significant. This is a part of a beautiful set of maps preserved in the central archives of Old Acts in Warsaw about the border negotiations that were taking place at the turn of the 1770s and 1780s, a time in which the Russian Empire was exploiting the natural, that is to say, the woods, the cattle, and the human resources, carting off inserted peasants to the Russian Empire. Before a deal was struck that pushed the frontier substantially back into the Commonwealth compared to where, by treaty, it should have been. And these negotiations and this situation has been presented by Ewa Zielińska, and then more generally by Zofia Zielińska, and by anyone, and by Adam Dalniczuk in the run-up to the 4 years Sejm. The meeting of Stanisław August and Catherine II on the Dnipro by Kyiv, it's a place of immense significance in sort of to the Ukrainian nation in terms of the sort of the funeral of sort of Taras Shevchenko, captured in art, preserved at the Boris Vozhnitsky National Gallery in Lviv, work by Plerch. And this is, this is film. This is so suitable for a film. The dramatic meeting, after all those years of former lovers, in an effort to change the geopolitics of this part of Europe. And note in the second picture, you have the fireworks in honor of Catherine II, produced at great expense by Stanisław August. And right down at the bottom of the hill, known as the Moskiewka, ironically, we can see a church. Three-domed. We could say that it was in his journey to Kyiv that Stanisław August really came to appreciate the particular situation and the particular problems, confessional, political, social, of the Ukrainian lands, and this affected the way in which this was discussed during the 4-year Sejm. Now, I'm aware of the time. I have no wish to sort of prolong it. I've written and spoken on this before. But what I will say is that the 4 years Sejm, 1788 to 92, brought a kind of transformation. From the panic that affected most of the local nobles, and many of those far deeper into the Commonwealth in 1789, that the Kolishchizna was going to happen all over again because of Potyomkin's provoking, and also the age-old fears evoked by Tomasz Henkonarski about the character of the peasants. This does seem to have forced a significant number of parliamentarians to start treating Ukraine and Ruthenia seriously, to attend to its problems, to try and come up with remedies, particularly in the confessional situation, by raising the status of the Uniate Church and by also establishing an autonomous Orthodox hierarchy cut off from the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg, a theme that, of course, is of immense relevance at the present day. Now, bearing in mind what I said about the boundaries much earlier, we can ask how Polish the Polish Revolution was. Polish Revolution being the term used by contemporaries. But of course, most of the Commonwealth population, most of its territory were not in what you might call ethnic Poland, let alone the borders of sort of Poland today. And we have to think when parliamentarians who were very proud of their sort of Ruthenian or Lithuanian identities, trying to excel themselves and beat their sort of ethnically Polish college in proclaiming themselves as sort of Polish patriots. And then what were the perspectives for the future? Was this going to, it was certainly going to go in the direction of political, social reform, but would the Commonwealth have been more successful in dealing with the problems and the challenges of Ukraine and Ruthenia than Great Britain was in dealing with the problems and the challenges of Ireland? Would, like Gladstone, hypothetical Polish statesmen of the 19th century, have found that they had solved the Ukrainian problem only for the Ukrainians to change the problem, in the same way that Gladstone said that he solved the Irish problem several times, but the Irish kept changing the problem? What this could also be said is that remedies would have been produced too little, too late on every occasion, leading to sort of further escalation. And then there's the figure of Hugo Kołłątaj, the visionary of the revolution, who set out a vision of a property-owning citizenry, prosperous tenant farmers, but to some extent a civic education that was the same for all religions. But to some extent, Kołłątaj was also interested in using the Polish language as a means of unification. Now, there are debates over the Confederacy of Targovica or Tohovica in Ukrainian and the undeclared war or special military operation of 1792. Now, a long list of historians who've sort of engaged on the question of the war and the Confederacy. It will be great to see Ukrainian research on this, particularly given the importance of the Crown campaign from one end of the Commonwealth's Ukraine to the other. The importance of the Battle of Zhelence or Zhelince, a regiment that recruited locally, that fought particularly intensive there, was singled out by the Russians to be disbanded in the aftermath. So, work to be done on what this looked like on the ground between the far southeast and the River Bug. And then we get to the Kościuszko insurrection, which we've just had an exhibition of at the Polish History Museum. And you can certainly make out the case that this is a Polish event, that this was a Lithuanian event. Kościuszko spoke of himself as a Lithuanian, at least in Polish context. A Belarusian event, the inspiration this provided for Kastus Kalinowski, for example. A Latvian event, nowhere was the rising more bloody than in the Duchy of Courland. But to what extent was it a Ukrainian event? Yes, there were efforts to sort of raise soldiers and to bring soldiers that had been absorbed into the Russian army, to bring them out, to get them to take part. There were diversions in Volhynia, but this seems to be, perhaps the sort of a weaker link than in certain other parts of the Commonwealth. As for Kościuszko himself, who went to school at Lubieszew, he certainly believed when he'd been posted to the sort of Ukrainian division in 1789 that he thought that it was important to get people to speak Polish, to sort of bring them together that way, which might not have gone down very well. On the other hand, the liberator, an inspiration. So among other things, we had a song of Ukrainian Cossacks about Kościuszko in the insurrection. I'd like to pay particular tribute to my co-curator, Michał Bąk, who's researched the way in which the soldiers stranded in Ukraine trying to sort of get back to sort of take part in the insurrection. And among the exhibits of the exhibition, we also had a book that we made on the basis of members of a particular regiment recruited locally, which gave their names, the place they had come from, whether it was the Commonwealth or Galicia or somewhere else, their religion, their height, lower than it was at the moment. And it's clear that most of the members of this regiment were in fact Uniates. There were some Orthodox, one or two Lutherans or Calvinists, some Latin Catholics. And looking at the names, looking at origins, we can say that many of those who fought on the side of the insurgents for the cause of the insurrection were Ukrainians. So I've gone on longer than I intended, but I'd like you to, but in terms of the idea of a conference about text, I'd like to leave you with this one of my favorites. I've cited it before, the speech made by Stanisław Soltek, envoy for Krakow, on the 21st of May, after the announcement of the Russian invasion of the Commonwealth, and on the day when the Sejm voted for an autonomous or autocephalous Orthodox hierarchy for the Commonwealth, and he made the case against some ecclesiastical critics who nevertheless lost the vote for that orderly freedom, rządna wolność, was the best defense against a foreign despot. So liberty is our greatest secret against any foreign usurpation. It is the strongest defensive wall against neighbors' invasions. Let people speak different languages. Let there be differences between them as regards religion. Freedom, when well understood, justice, when given strictly to everyone, will unite them most swiftly and will teach one sentiment in the same expressions of their own liberties. So that, I hope, is sort of an uplifting testament. I mean, that, to my mind, is the Commonwealth as its best, not necessarily the Commonwealth as it was, perhaps the Commonwealth as it might have been, but it's something to finish with. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Batrevic, for this detailed, thought-provoking and stimulating overview of the state of the art in the field of Polish-Ukrainian short 18th century history. And you raised so many excellent and important questions, but answered not all of them. So I hope that we still have some time for the discussion, and I open the floor for the questions and comments. If you want, you could raise your hand and ask your question. Maybe I could start with two questions. One about blank spots. So what about intellectual dimension of the story, about intellectual history? You mentioned the Union Church and the expansion of the Union Church and Latinization of this church. But what about other developments? For instance, could we speak about the impact of the Enlightenment in the Ukrainian part of the Commonwealth during the short 18th century before the first partitions, or some other intellectual developments that very important? And my second question is about red flags. Yes, so you addressed this issue of the debate about the applicability of post-colonial theory and colonial approaches to the history of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the place of Ukraine. And you even asked this question, let me quote, I noticed this. To what extent were these profoundly asymmetrical relations between Poland and Ukraine colonial? Yeah, you asked this question, but you didn't answer. Maybe you could comment. What do you think? Could we apply this post-colonial or colonial approaches to the history of Polish-Ukrainian encounter in the early modern period and during the 18th century?
Thank you very much, professors, for those extremely thought-provoking questions. I'll start with the question of the Enlightenment. We can either sort of treat this as a question of sort of writers, or we can sort of treat this as a sort of a more general sort of sense of improving culture. In terms of the sort of the more intellectual approach to the Enlightenment, then I think we would certainly see it concentrated in sort of educational establishments and among the professors, perhaps corresponding with each other, of those educational establishments. So I think that the sort of emphasis on the Union Church, in particular the Basilian schools, and if I'm going to go even more specific, the Basilian School of Volodymyr and its rector Julian Antonovich, who published the first English grammar in the Polish language in the 1780s. So when Stanisław August passed through either on his way to Kyiv or on the way back, I can't remember off the top of my head, he was greeted by the pupils of that school in a whole range of language, including English. So this would clearly be sort of one of the sort of centers of this. And then there's the question of publication, the publishing presses. Some of the things that were published by monastic presses were, anti-enlightened, particularly some of those that came out of Dominican presses. But, if you have a sort of a public sphere of things being discussed, Joseph II found to his cost that not everything that comes out of the public sphere is pro-reform. Some of it can be sort of anti-reform. But that sort of sense of intense debate was there, and at sort of market towns when quarterly contracts were exchanged, then you could also get sort of pamphlets, being sort of exchanged or sold, particularly during the 4 years same. We could also think, however, about some of the writers from the region and the way they sort of encountered it. Adam Narushevich sort of crosses the Belarusian Ukrainian frontier in some respects, but he's certainly an important figure for the way in which the region was perceived, but also in which it could sort of represent itself. Even Adam Kazimierz Czartoryski proudly described himself as a sort of an ancient Ruthenian or an old Ruthenian. During debates in the same. So in that sense, it goes right to the very top. But if we see the Enlightenment as a sort of a more general improving phenomenon, then we've got to think about sort of agricultural experiments, about experiments in sort of moving labor services over to cash rents. And for example, the way in which Prince Stanisław Poniatowski, who held the Starostwo of Kyiv, conducted these kind of experiments in his estates as well. And some of the sort of owners of towns were, you know, all in favor of sort of innovation at a time of dynamic economic growth. So I think there is plenty to be said about this, but I don't really think that we can see that the Polish-Ukrainian 18th century produced its, you know, anyone, to sort of stand up among the sort of the international luminaries of the Enlightenment, although if someone can think of someone, I'll be delighted to know. As to my own view on how colonial are profoundly unequal and asymmetrical relations, such as were found in the Ukrainian and Ruthenian palatinates of the Polish crown in the 18th century, I think for the word colonial to make sense, I think you need to have some kind of colonization, that is to say, some kind of settlement from outside. And I don't really see very much of that, of people being sort of brought to be settled from the sort of a very different ethnic part of the world in the 18th century. And in any case, when Mazovian peasants did move east, they rapidly started to go to the sort of the local church and adopt the local language, and we get the opposite phenomenon to pollinization. So I'm pretty skeptical, to be honest, about how far we could see this as a colonial relationship. Having said that, I do see some similarities. I'm persuadable on this, particularly after my years in Belfast and contact with Irish historians, that if there are elements of a colonial situation in early modern Ireland, then I certainly think there are analogies in sort of early modern Poland, Lithuania. Perhaps there's a bit more of this situation in some ways, I don't know, in 15th century Red Ruthenia than in the 18th century.
Okay, thank you, Professor Butterwick. I see the hand of Frank. Please, Frank.
Okay, yeah, I obviously will get the chance to produce the long 18th century tomorrow, so I won't go into that. I think this was a fantastic and rich overview that you have given us, and you have also pointed that historians write in a given time. I thought of this as you mentioned Vladislav Serček. These books, not only on the Koliushina Haidamachina, but his history of Ukraine, which at the time they were written were viewed quite positively. And yet once the old system fell, the books were viewed much more negatively than they had been earlier. This came up, I think, in a number of occasions. What I'm curious about is the current situation in Polish writing. I realize we've only had a few years of the full-scale war in Ukraine, but we see it has dramatically affected how Ukrainian historians value or evaluate these phenomena in the past. And we already have lively discussions with Zozoliak and Starshenko and Brekунenko, in which the Commonwealth plays a major role. Some viewing it quite positively even within the context of the long-term projection of that society. Some viewing it, continuing to view it in quite a different way. Do you see at the moment Polish historiography being influenced by the situation of the war and reconsiderations?
Thank you very much, Frank. The lead into publications takes quite a while, and once people have sort of started a sort of research project, it will then take some years for it to be sort of brought to sort of fruition and then to sort of publication. I do get the impression, however, that the blinds have come off as far as sort of Russian policy is concerned. If you look at the work of Zofia Zielinska, for example, you can see how far she's come from the way in which her masters, Jerzy Michalski and Immanuel Rostworowski, used to view the world. They sort of viewed it as sort of more or less sort of axiomatic that the Commonwealth's best interest in the 18th century was to stay close to Russia, not provoke Russia, reform gradually, and that an open breach was going to bring disaster. And this led to their sort of understanding and praise of the policies pursued by Stanisław August Poniatowski. It was also the case that sort of, it wasn't particularly politic to write about Russian abuses in the Commonwealth while the communist system lasted. But, some of that sort of continued for some years afterwards. But these days, Zofia Zielinska has come to the conclusion that Russia was bent on destroying the Commonwealth utterly, first exploiting it and then destroying it, and that there was no long-term prospect of sort of lasting it out, and that Russia was at least as hostile to the Commonwealth as was Prussia. That doesn't mean that she's become any more critical of Stanisław August, not at all. She still argues that faced with the kind of blackmail he was under, his decision in 1792 especially was the logical one. She doesn't excuse the abdication. But I do think that research on the way in which Russia sort of moved the boundaries, abducted people, sort of cut down trees, generally humiliated people, and was determined, and Catherine in particular was determined to destroy the Commonwealth. I think that is something that's become more and more apparent in the last decade. I could also say that there is a general sort of wave of warmth among Polish historians, as more generally was the case among sort of Polish society towards Ukraine. I've certainly noticed that sort of gaining in strength over the last few years. That's not specifically to do with historians.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? I would like to remind that we have 3 official languages, English, Polish, and Ukrainian, so you may ask questions or comment in all of these languages if you would like, not only during this panel, but also during all our panels and events. Still, I don't see any other hands, and we ran out of our time. So thank you very much, Professor Butterwick, for this excellent start of our conference. Now we have a break, half of an hour, and then we meet again at 4 p.m. Ukrainian time, Kyiv time, for the book discussion panel devoted to the last monograph by Zenon Kohut entitled The Making of Cossack Ukraine, Political Thought, Culture and Identity Formation, 1569-1714. So exactly the prehistory of what Professor Butterwick told us now. And so thank you again, and let's see each other in half of an hour.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for listening to me. And I wish everyone a very successful, very enjoyable and inspiring conference with the hope of future conferences live in person.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being with us during this challenging time. We appreciate this. Thank you.